very good morning to everyone. My name is Alfonso Rosales. I'm the technical officer on regulation of medical devices at PAHO, headquartered in Washington, D.C., and it is a pleasure for me to extend the most cordial welcome to you. And before I get this going, I'd like to give the floor to our colleagues. And before I do that, I'd like to share with you a very brief message. Besides that, thanking you for your participation. We have simultaneous interpretation for those participants who may wish to follow the interpretation into English, into Portuguese, or into Spanish. And you can find the language of your choice in the icon that you have in the bottom of your screen. You have interpretation, and you simply have to select the right channel. So we wish to extend to you the most cordial welcome. And I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Mariluz Pombo. Maria Luz Pombo is the interim director of the Innovation Access Quality to Medicines and Other Technologies department to officially get this seminar going. Mariluz, welcome and thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alfonso. And thank you very much to our colleagues who are following us from the World Health Organization during this first webinar that in 4 consecutive days is attempting to create a knowledge space on this tool, the global benchmarking tool for the strengthening and regulation of medical devices. I'm Mariluz Pombo, interim director of the Innovation and Access to Medicines and Health Technologies Department and the Unit on Quality and Regulation of Health Technologies and Devices of PAHO. It is a great pleasure for me to see the interest shown by the region of the Americas on this topic. This region is characterized by having over a decade of work done in strengthening regulatory systems. But although we've had significant progress made on the regulation of pharmaceutical products and some biologicals, this progress has not been as outstanding in the regulation of medical devices that, as you know, in the course of the answer to the COVID-19 pandemic, they were the first inputs in medical devices in order to have this very critical situation that we're all going through. In this specific case, we received an audience of over 400 people with interest in order to sign up. And now, as you can see, the numbers continue to rise in today's participation. We have participants from 24 member states in the region of the Americas and even colleagues from PAHO in country offices and in regional offices, highly interested in hearing about this topic. We have a very active group of regulation of medical devices in the region that has been established for some years now, and that together in that effort of identifying better ways of having technical cooperation, we are trying to establish the agenda and the progress on the regulatory agenda on medical devices in the region. Without further ado, I would like to have a recap on the importance of regulatory systems in order to have timely access to the products that are needed by health systems, being the country's producers or not producers. But nowadays, to promote practices on the regulatory efficiency hinge on the installed capacities of that supervision all over the course of life of these technologies, that because of their variety and their very large number and use, make it more complex to have this regulation than for other categories of products. So we will pay attention here, learning together and creating an agenda that we hope will have the same success that other regulatory agendas have had in the region for over a decade in the Americas. So it's a pleasure that you're still with us. And thank you very much to WHO colleagues, to Anita, Agnes, and Andrea, that with their presentations today will kick off and trigger this cycle of regional discussions that are so relevant. Thank you very much, Mariluz, for your kind words, and welcome to our colleagues, those colleagues that are just joining us. I will switch it to English so that I can introduce our colleagues here from WHO and to give them the floor after that so that they can introduce themselves.
So thank you very much, everybody, for being here with us today. We welcome you on this webinar on strengthening regulatory systems on medical devices, and especially focus on the WHO Global Benchmarking Tool for plus medical devices, GBT+. I would like to pass the word to our colleagues from WHO, Andrea Cater, Anita Sanz, and Agnes Kijo, so they can introduce themselves and give you the welcoming words as well. Colleagues?
Thank you very much. Maybe I can just open the floor first to Anita and then Agnes, and then I'll go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Anita Sands. I have been working at WHO headquarters for over 20 years now, and I've always been working in the area related to IVD safety and quality. I am in the team that deals with substandard and falsified medical products, and I lead the work that we do to strengthen capacities for post-market surveillance and market surveillance of medical devices. It's nice to see you all here today. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Agnes Sitakijo. Of course, together with Anita and Andrea, I'm at the WHO headquarters in Geneva. I work in a team called Facilitated Products Introduction Team, but I also support the area of medical devices regulation, because the team that I work with works with countries to support product introduction. But beside that, I also support regulatory system strengthening for medical devices and IVDs. I'm very happy to be able to, attend this webinar. Also remembering the active role that some of the NRI in this region played when we were revising the Global Model Regulatory Framework for Medical Devices in 2023, but also during the development of the sub-indicators for the GBT plus medical devices. So it's very good to get to a point where we are seeing implementation, and I'm very excited on the next steps. So thank you very much. Over to you, Andrea.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. My name is Andrea Cater. I am in the Regulatory System Strengthening Team at the WHO headquarters in Geneva. And in the past, I was at the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority and the head of the medical device unit there. So I deeply understand what it takes to go from having zero regulation up into getting to a point where now you're starting to initiate activities related to regulating medical devices. Also, I am the focal person at WHO headquarters for the Coalition of Interested Parties Network, which is a framework that we use where we have technical and financial partners who are very actively and in a coordinated manner supporting regulatory system strengthening, directly related to those key areas for improvement that we identify through benchmarking activities. So I think these really go quite hand in hand, and I'm excited to be with you this week. This is really a great initiative, and we thank you for your interest and participation. Thanks. Over.
Thank you. Thank you very much, colleagues. I would like to share my screen very quickly. And I'm going to switch to Spanish again. Gracias a todos y a nuestros colegas por su introducción. ¿Pueden ver mi pantalla? ¿Sí se está compartiendo la agenda? Ok. Como ha sido mencionado, este es un esfuerzo que estamos desarrollando en conjunto con la Organización Mundial de la Salud y la Organización Panamericana de la Salud. Para los próximos 4 días, poder brindar un apoyo técnico a nuestros Estados miembros sobre cuáles son los fundamentos con relación a la regulación de dispositivos médicos y las herramientas de evaluación de referenciamiento global en regulación. Compartimos con ustedes la semana pasada la última versión de nuestra agenda, que está seccionada en 4 días. Tendremos 4 sesiones virtuales de hora y media cada una. Además de la traducción que ya les habíamos mencionado inicialmente, vamos a tener la particularidad de grabar estas sesiones para incluirlas dentro del programa RegTech, el itinerario formativo en formación de capacidades en regulación de productos sanitarios, estas enfocadas principalmente en regulación de dispositivos médicos, que van a ser de acceso, público acceso, a todos los interesados en el futuro, en los 3 idiomas, español, portugués e inglés. Muy bien, para el día de hoy estamos en la fase de sesión de apertura. Además de habernos presentado, pasaré adelante la palabra a nuestros colegas de OMS nuevamente para describir los objetivos y resultados esperados y vamos a hacer un intento de realizar una foto grupal, dado el alto número de participantes registrados que tenemos, pero nos moveremos de diferentes pantallas. Creo que ahorita lo confirmamos con el área técnica, si es posible que todos abramos la cámara o no. Y enseguida tendremos una fase de 15 minutos en donde daremos un panorama general acerca del estado de regulación de dispositivos médicos en la región de las Américas, seguido por una presentación de nuestra colega Agnes Quillo sobre el modelo regulatorio de la OMS para dispositivos médicos, la autorización en el uso de emergencia y la clasificación de riesgo. Después de la presentación de Agnes, Andrea nos va a facilitar una presentación presentando el programa de fortalecimiento de sistemas regulatorios de la Organización Mundial de la Salud, y cerraremos la sesión del día de hoy con preguntas y respuestas. A lo cual recuerdo que, por favor, cualquier consulta que tengan o comentario que quieran expresar, siéntanse en la libertad de colocarlo en la sección correspondiente de preguntas y respuestas, y estaremos intentando responderlas en vivo si nos es posible, y si no, las responderemos en el transcurso del día. Sin más preámbulo, Andrea, te cedo nuevamente la palabra para realizar la continuidad del taller.
Thank you very much, Alfonso, and I will just share my screen. Just confirm that you can see that.
We
Great.
can see Andrea.
Super, thank you so much. So let's get going. I think also just with the participants on the group, we're all connected from different countries, different time zones, and joining now. It's not always so easy in this format to hear from you, but I think it would be great if I can ask you just to be activated. So if there are those of you, if you can put a thumbs up symbol in the chat, I just asked the question, how many of you have already started regulating medical devices in your country? And just put a thumbs up. We can see if the chat lights up with some of the responses, just to get those thinking caps on. We are getting, so far we just have one. Great, so they're coming in. I think also our group that we're going to be with over the next few days, many of you are at different levels. Some of you may have already started regulating medical devices, and for others, this might be the first time. It might be the first time that you are looking at the WHO GBT+ medical device tool, or considering where to start if this is the first time regulating medical devices. So we're really excited to be with you on this journey. We have got quite a nice program planned for the next couple of days, but really our objective from this webinar is to be able to strengthen national regulatory authorities in regulating medical devices. We know that we all have a very common goal, that when it comes to medical devices, those products that are on our markets, we want to make sure that they are of good quality, that they perform as they are expected to perform, and that they are of the relevant safety. And we also hope that over this week, we can share some insight into the WHO Regulatory System Strengthening Program, sensitize you to the WHO Global Benchmarking Tool plus medical devices, which we call the GBT plus medical device, provide you with an overview of the global model regulatory framework for medical devices, as well as to give you some guidance in terms of how to do post-market surveillance and market surveillance of medical devices. So you will see that we've also scheduled within the agenda some time just to have some practical examples. We would like to demonstrate the GBT plus medical devices to you, as well as do some information sharing on key topics that we see regulators often are faced with or have to consider as they start up with their regulation of medical devices, or if you have already initiated, how to just strengthen those activities that you are performing in terms of your regulatory functions as you cover the mandate for regulatory oversight of medical devices. So this is going to be a great week together. We are looking forward to that. Already, Alfonso kindly covered the agenda of today's first session. And just to share with you what is planned in the upcoming sessions. So tomorrow, we will be giving you some insight into how the global benchmarking tool plus medical devices was developed and what the structure of the tool is, as well as being joined by our colleague, Ms. Ala Magdi, who will do a very intensive practical demonstration so that you get an idea of how to download the computerized global benchmarking tool onto your computers, how to import a data file, which then fits into the computerized tool, and what that GBT plus medical devices looks like. We will also do a demonstration. So we've got sessions that we've called the CGBT Clinic, which is where we'd actually open up the tool and run through some of those indicators under the different regulatory functions, as well as explore what the requirements are of the sub-indicators that we see in the tool. We will also have some practice on the use of the CGBT and application of the fact sheets. So it's going to be quite a great practical session, and you can follow along on your own computers as we work through the tool. On the third day, which is on Thursday, Anita will share some guidance on post-market surveillance and market surveillance of medical devices, as well as run through a review of the fact sheets that are related to what we call the PS function, which is post-market surveillance, market surveillance and control, as well as laboratory testing. Again, we have a practical session on the use of the CGBT and how to understand the requirements that we see in each of the fact sheets under the sub-indicators. Each day you will notice there is a time for Q&A, and as Alfonso already shared, we will try to address your questions during those Q&A sessions. If we don't get around to all of them, you're also welcome to put your questions into the chat, and we can then address those at a later stage. Then on the last day, on Friday, we have a presentation by Agnes on how to consider reliance for medical devices. We also have a clinic on the review of some fact sheets related to registration and market authorization, and again, practice on how to use the computerized GBT, Q&A session, and then we would also have an evaluation of the meeting, wrap-ups and next steps. So that's just an overview in terms of the agenda for the week, as well as understanding what the purpose of this webinar is and our expected outcomes by the end of the week. So I think now, I don't know how practical it is, but we will be attempting to take the group photo in a minute. And just to share two resources with you, this webinar is an event of the WHO, and we always follow our strict code of conduct. So we have just an information resource here on our code of conduct. We also have a QR code here if you would like to subscribe to receive the WHO regulation and pre-qualification newsletter, which we send out on a monthly basis with updates of the activities of WHO in this context. And I think this is quite an exciting one. Please do grab this QR code on your screen now. This is a link to the learning catalog that WHO has prepared, and it provides a very nice listing of the type of training that is available, much of which is online and self-paced. So it's really a strong resource if you are interested in certain training topics, and it does extend beyond medical devices and beyond the GBT. So this is a great resource if you are interested in pursuing some training activities and just familiarizing yourself with the type of learning opportunities that are available. So with that, I end the presentation, and thank you very much.
I'm going to switch to Portuguese to welcome our colleagues from Brazil. We are happy to have them here. I'm going to continue to present to you the regulatory and medical device situation in the Americas. I am going to share my screen. At
Going on with
least
the
I
presentation,
cannot see
and I
it.
will review the presentation
This
in
is
Spanish.
one of the
The
interpreters.
purpose of this next session is to have the overview status of MDR in the region of the Americas. Without further ado, let us get this going. On this timeline, we have milestones that show the efforts that have been deployed in the last 25 years in the region of the Americas. Only a few of them in order to strengthen the regulation on medical devices. Instead of having an overview of the timeline, let me explain this concentrating on three different approaches. The first approach that I'd like to talk about today are two important milestones that have to do with WHO and PAHO resolutions. The first one in 2000, when we adopted the resolution of governing bodies 42R11 to modernize the pharmaceutical regulation in order to guarantee access to safe and effective medicines. Pharmaceutical regulation is our topic, and let me explain this. In this resolution, we promoted the creation of the Pan-American Network for the Harmonization of Pharmaceutical Line, and I will call it as a FarmPack for the exchange of experiences. It is known as the PARF network.
The second benchmark here is, or we're looking at the strengthening of the regulatory systems for other health technologies and medicines. So this has become the roadmap for PAHO and the Secretariat in order to advance two key areas. First, promoting that all member states have sufficient regulatory systems and have the capacity to ensure quality and safety as well as effectiveness of health technologies according to the PAHO WHO sanitary international health regulations to ensure again, that we maintain economic and social development and well-being. These policies summarize these four PAHO mandate. First of all, to promote policies that are sustainable for nations to strengthen governance and also stewardship of regulatory systems. Secondly, to strengthen harmonization and convergence, regulatory convergence. Third, to strengthen and promote the regulatory systems that have consistent, transparent mechanisms and regulatory science support, and also adopt new evaluation systems based on the WHO global tool. These are public documents that are available, and these will be included in the link with the presentation. And of course, in our final message, we want to make sure that you know that all of the presentations are going to be made available in the folder that we put in the cloud that will provide access to all of the participants who have registered for this event. They're going to be in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. The second area that I want to focus on in our timeline, I want to discuss technical cooperation mechanisms that have to do with the regional working group on the medical device regulatory systems. The regional working group on the regulation of medical devices began in 2002, and at that moment, 12 countries met in Havana, Cuba, in order to review the regulatory capacity in medical device as well as promote the cooperation. This group has now currently 25 members that covers pretty much the totality of the medical regulatory agencies throughout the years. This group and the follow-up was headed very successfully by my colleague, Ms. Engruber, that includes interim director of medical devices I'd like to publicly express my acknowledgement and thanks for all of the efforts undertaken by those of you involved. As you are aware, the working group focuses in these 5 key areas, lines of effort. We have in-person meetings, virtual meetings that includes advances in this area, as well as developing the roadmap. Up to the present time, we even had a meeting virtual meeting in 2022, the cooperation with IMRDF. Then we also have the development of the capacities and training programs that include both in-person as well as virtual meetings. And we have seen great success in this area. Then we also have the International Forum for Regulators on Medical Devices. Here we have special emphasis in our region with active engagement where we have 3 executive members. We have observer, we have 8 affiliate members, and others are now being considered for incorporation. PAHO, in its role as secretariat, fulfills a full engagement within the harmonization process. The 4th area has to do with working groups that address specific needs that are not covered by other regional initiatives. And then the 5th area has to do with the development of basic regulatory indicators, that these are areas that we're now focusing more efforts on. Now, with the development of skills and looking at the needs and responses, working with INDIMA, we have developed 2 courses on medical regulatory practices with medical devices. I'm not going to focus a lot of attention on this, but I will provide some key information as to what's been undertaken over the last couple of years. We've been able to provide these courses both in English and Spanish. They've been implemented in English-speaking countries, and as you can see, the courses have been taught on several occasions. This has provided benefits to participant countries. Regarding the PARF network, this addresses the convergence, regulatory convergence in the Americas. In this picture, we can see the key milestones going back to 1997 and 2 key phases, one before and one after 2014. Before 2014, the network had a focus based on regulatory harmonization, supported by development of skills and capacities. Yet in 2014, a new model was developed that strengthened regulatory governance with focus on risks and international standards. This focus impacted other health technologies because the network includes the medical devices specifically. This is where I was referring to why, despite not being members of the network, these medical devices are considered within the realm of pharmaceuticals. This is the pulse of the convergence, the use of an update of training of human resources in response to these new mandates. As I already mentioned, medical devices have now become a strategic priority within the regional agenda. During the last conference of the network that was held in 2024 in Mexico, for the first time, there was a plenary session that was devoted exclusively to the regulatory processes. Here, experts and key stakeholders looked at specific challenges faced by medical device regulatory systems, and they looked at these key conclusions. The first was to provide technical cooperation for the adoption of international recommendations. The second was having to do with the increase in encouraging greater participation of countries in the international harmonization mechanisms. Third, strengthening the post-marketing surveillance and strengthening cooperation between countries that encourage and support regulatory reliance. And then looking at promoting South-South cooperation for the exchange of knowledge and experiences within the various regulatory systems at various levels of development. Within the relevance of the area of medical devices, the steering committee at the end of last year, they received key recommendations from the conference, which included evaluating the governance framework, the strategic areas aimed at strengthening access to health technologies. The steering committee, headed by the representatives of governments in the Americas and its founding members, as we can see on the slide, were included. What I want to highlight from this is that we've seen some key findings relating to medical devices. It was suggested to adopt the work modalities, including the creation of new groups related to medical devices. The second area has to do with strengthening the regulatory systems with emphasis on medical trials as well as post-market surveillance. Thirdly, proposals that were launched and supported by regulatory authorities in Central America and the Caribbean that promote the implementation of projects that involve medical devices. For example, one proposal was to translate the implementation of catalogs of terminologies for adverse events and the proposals of seminars to identify the standards as medical devices as well as counterfeit medical device challenges. Well, the other thing I want to focus on with a timeline, I'd like to highlight some of the key activities that in our region have been undertaken and contributed to the development of the global framework, global benchmarking tools and framework. I'm going to just discuss some of the specific milestones. In 2013, an effort was undertaken in order to regional mapping on the regulations and basic indicators. And then in 2015, development of indicators and a pilot project were launched in 5 countries. 2020, there was active participation in our region with the working group focused on GBT+ and medical devices. Subsequently, a working group that participated in the development of the regulatory framework, global regulatory framework. I didn't want to get, and this is where I didn't want to get into too much detail about these final results because this is going to be the objective of the presentations given by our colleagues. They're going to delve into this during the upcoming discussions. But I did want to devote just a moment to highlight that the basic and advanced regulatory indicators, and this effort was an input used in the development of the GBT plus medical devices, whose updated version was published at the beginning of this year. In this exercise, 11 modules were used with 55 indicators, and the basic focus was we were able to identify, of the 5 countries that were identified or consulted, fulfilled or complied with 90% of the indicators, 11 complied with at least 75% of the indicators, and 5 complied with less than 50% of the implementation, which reflects the fact that in our region there are different levels of regulatory evaluation. So given the diversity that's well known by all of you, an analysis, a country-by-country analysis, was conducted during a considerable amount of time. And with this slide, I just want to highlight some of the key classic actions that will allow us to provide a clear overview as to what the activities currently underway are about. This group of countries, and I can mention some of the Caribbean countries that are developing their first regulatory frameworks for these areas. There are other countries that are currently updating an update of their regulatory framework to be consistent with international standards. There's a group of countries that have made public their draft documents for public consultation to receive comments from stakeholders involved. And then finally, there's a group of countries that are preparing documents and guidance to support the compliance and implementation process. But in addition to that, I just want to highlight some of the various technical cooperation mechanisms that we are working with, initiatives to strengthen capacities and for the harmonization of knowledge. This is in order to reinforce the regulatory systems. This is just one example of what we discussed. And I'd like to
Thank you very much, Alfonso. Can you confirm if you can see my slides well?
Yeah.
Perfect. So thank you very much, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, sorry, I was having a glitch on my side. So let me just jump into my presentation. As introduced earlier, so my name is Agnes Sitakijo. I work in the WHO headquarters in a team called Facilitated Products Introduction Team. I will be taking you through the presentation on Global Model Regulatory Framework, which is a document that was developed in 2017. So the initial document was published in 2017, and we conducted a major review on the document in 2022, and was later published in 2023. So why do we have the Global Model Regulatory Framework? But while I continue with my presentation, I would like also to ask colleagues from the NRI just to indicate on the chart who has not heard about the Global Model Regulatory Framework. I know some have heard about this document, but it would be very interesting also to know who is hearing the Global Model Regulatory Framework for the first time. So kindly indicate this on the shared point so that I know exactly who to reach out after my presentation. So this document, this nicely written green book, was developed by WHO initially in 2017, solely for the member states, and to be precise, for the national regulatory authorities. And the reason why this document was developed really was to address the issue of diversities in terms of regulatory systems for medical devices and IVDs. We had realized that different countries were taking different approaches on how to regulate medical devices and IVDs. And so this is the reason why this document was developed, but also to help countries who are beginning to regulate medical devices, but also for those that who wants to advance from the higher level of regulation and enforcement. And so some of the, as much as the 2017 version was very good, but considering that the area of medical devices and IVDs changes very rapidly, we realized that after 5 years of implementation, there was a need to update the document. And also there are some important documents from WHO that were updated. For example, publishing or updating of the post-market market surveillance guidance for medical devices and IVDs, which is going to be presented by my colleague Anita, but also publishing of 2 other important documents, which is the Good Reliance Practices Guideline document, but also Good Regulatory Practices document. Again, during the integration of the sub-indicators for the GBT plus medical devices, we realized that there was a need also to update the global model regulatory framework and provide specific recommendations for some of the specific areas of regulation of medical devices based on the feedback that we received during the interaction. Another trigger also for revision was the experience with implementation. So we also received a number of feedback from colleagues who have been using the 2017 version, and there was a request that, we expand a little bit the information in the global model regulatory framework for them to be able to benefit with what we would include in this revised version. For example, I'll just give an example. In the 2017 version, we did not have a section that provides recommendation on how to begin implementation. So as much as we provided a lot of guidance in terms of what are the basic level elements, what are the expanded level elements, how do you then advance from the basic to the expanded level of regulation and enforcement, but we lacked recommendation on how to begin implementation at each of the 2 phases that are recommended in the global model regulatory framework. But of course, the experience during the COVID-19 pandemic, and especially how critical the issue of reliance was during that time. So we really saw an opportunity to expand the concept of reliance throughout the global model regulatory framework. So this was the thinking behind revising the 2017 version of the global model regulatory frameworks. One of the things that I also want to explain a little bit is that as much as we revised heavily the text in the 2017 version, there are some of the key concepts that remains the same. And you would also see this also when we start going through the GBT plus medical devices, you will also see some of these concepts and some of this thinking also appearing in the GBT plus medical devices. So the issue of risk-based approach, this is also very visible and emphasized in the global model regulatory framework. And so the idea is a need for regulatory authorities to have a balance between the risk of the medical devices versus regulatory control. And I think the beauty about medical devices and IVDs is that we are already supported by the 4 classes of medical devices in which global model regulatory framework recommends that the 4 risk classes that are recommended by the IMDRF should also be considered in your regulatory framework. And so we are proposing class A to class D, but we are also recommending that the risk classes that have also been developed by the IMDRF should also be used as part of your in your regulatory framework when you're deciding regulatory controls for the products. But we have also highlighted in the revised version, just emphasizing on the 2017 version, that there has to be differences in terms of conformity assessment between the different groups of medical devices. So the expectation is we don't expect the same efforts that are placed on class D, which is the highest risk class for medical devices, to be also implemented in a class A, which is a lower risk medical device. And so when you're doing conformity assessment, when you are receiving your dossier, when you're assigning different assessors, or the different files to assess between class A and D, you also need to consider different approach, different conformity assessment between the four risk classes of medical devices. So this particular concept is still emphasized in the global, in the revised version of the Global Model Regulatory Framework. I'm just going to take you through also very briefly on some of the chapters, but also to relate on the GBT plus medical devices. For example, chapter 4, and I'm not going to start with chapter 1 because chapter 1, 2, 3 is just the usual structure of the documents, abbreviations, a table of contents, acknowledgement, etc. But from chapter 4, this is where you really go into the heart of the Global Model Regulatory Framework in terms of now recommending what is the definition that needs to be adopted by the national regulatory authorities. For example, the definition that we are recommending in the revised version of the GMRF is the definition that has been internationally harmonized and recommended by the IMDRF. Again, classification I've also mentioned, essential principles and conformity assessment of medical devices. So all these four critical elements, we are recommending that is adopted based on the recommendation by the IMDRF, considering that there is already implementation, there is already advocacy, there is already harmonized definitions, classification, but also essential principles, and the approach to do conformity assessment of medical devices by the IMDRF. And so in chapter 4, we've also made very explicit the concept of reliance and the concept of reliance, but also good regulatory practices. And I think it is throughout the whole Global Model Regulatory Framework where you will see these principles appearing. Just also to relate to the Global Model Regulatory Framework and the GBT, if you look at the GBT from tomorrow, basically, you will see that under RSO 101, it requires national regulatory authorities to define scope. And therefore, it requires for the NRI to indicate whether there is a legal provision that defines the scope of products that are to be regulated. And this is where now the issue of definition becomes very critical, because if, for example, you have a definition that is not comprehensive, it will definitely affect the scope of regulation. And so very important that the scope of the definition aligns with the rest of the world, especially the IMDRF definition, so that you can have a very comprehensive definition of medical devices, but also it will support during reliance. Imagine if you have a completely different definition from the rest of the world. It means it will be difficult once implementing reliance for medical devices and IVDs, because you will be defining your medical devices different from other regulators that you may wish to collaborate with. Again, for classification, I've also indicated a subsequent sub-indicators that relates to the issue of classification, but also essential principles in conformity assessment of medical devices under market authorization function. I'm not going to go into the details of chapter 5. Chapter 5 really is provides recommendation based on good regulatory practice. And so you would see some of the elements appearing, such as, for example, need for to have legal requirements in place, issues around gap analysis, implementation plan, that national regulatory authorities will need to have an implementation plan once the gaps have been identified, monitoring and implementation. This is also an element that you will see in the GBT plus medical devices, issue of funding, conflict of interest and impartiality, and most important, also regulatory competences and resources. But you be able to read these important elements and recommendations in the Global Model Regulatory Framework, which I will share the link on chat. I will not go into the much details in terms of the section itself, but if you look at the current version of the Global Model Regulatory Framework under section 4.2, this is where we have provided extensively the issue of medical devices classification and classification rules. But I think one of the things that I want to point out in this particular slide is or for you to pay attention really, is the classification rules for medical devices. Very important also that you have a way in which you can be able to identify correctly the risk class of a medical devices based on the risk classification rules that have been provided by the IMDRIF. For example, for medical devices, there are 16 rules that are associated with classification of medical devices. So rules associated with non-invasive devices, rules that are associated with invasive devices, active devices, but also additional rules in case when you're not sure or you can not be able to place any of the medical devices in the 3 other categories. There are additional rules that can help you also assign a correct risk class for that medical device. And also 7 risk classification rules for the in vitro diagnostics. Also maybe in this slide is to clarify again on the issue of classification. So the first individual or person that classifies the medical devices is the manufacturer of the product, because the manufacturer of the product is the one that has the general understanding of the medical devices in terms of their performance, in terms of the technology itself. And so we expect the manufacturer to, using also the same classification rules that I have mentioned, to place their medical device in a specific risk class. And therefore, once the National Regulatory Authority receives the application for market authorization, we expect the National Regulatory Authority to conduct assessments to go through the risk classification rules and assign correctly the class of that medical devices. There could be several reasons why sometimes the manufacturers would assign the wrongly class of that medical devices. And so it is very important that the National Regulatory Authority makes the final decision in terms of the class of that medical devices, so that you can also place the appropriate regulatory effort on that particular product. For example, if a manufacturer for whatever reason submit an application and assigns class A for a product that is supposed to be class D, it means even the assessment efforts will be less as compared to the risk of that particular product. And so very important that regulators revisit the class that has been assigned by the manufacturer to this particular medical device or IVDs, and assign the correct risk class so that the required efforts can be placed during assessment. I've just given an example, and as mentioned by Alfonso, you will also have these slides on the SharePoint. But I've provided just a simple example of how you can determine classification. Risk class of an IVD, and I've provided just an example in a schematic format, which would really help you to assign or to just look at the picture and see exactly where how you can assign the class of that medical devices. For example, I would go to Rule 4. Rule 4 talks about self-test or near patient test for high-risk disease. So, for example, if you receive a test that is required to be used by the patient themselves, if it says yes, you would also have to go further and say, is the device for testing fertility, or is it for pregnancy or for cholesterol? If it is no, then you place it under class C. If it is yes, if it is for pregnancy test, then you place it under class B. So this is a way in which different classes of medical devices can be placed. It's not complicated, but it's important that as a regulator, you take the responsibility to really look at the rules and place the device correctly and assign the correct conformity assessment to the medical device or IVDs. So I'm going also to speak briefly on the chapter 6, which really explains the different ways in which the regulatory authorities can move from the basic level of regulatory control and of enforcement to the expanded level of regulatory control and their enforcement, but also emphasizing on where between the basic level regulatory control and enforcement and the expanded level of regulatory control and enforcement, where you can apply reliance and recognition. So the global model regulatory framework recommends only 2 phases. So it's either you are on the basic level, this is like the lowest level of controls, where we have also recommended specific elements that needs to be implemented by the National Regulatory Authority at this particular level. And when you want to expand further to the expanded level of regulatory control and their enforcement, we have also suggested specific elements that needs to be in place for a national regulatory authorities to be considered regulating in an expanded level of control in their enforcement. And so there is a lot of information that has been provided there at each of the element, what it is that you need to have in place for you to be able to have an oversight at the basic level, which will be almost similar to the expanded level, because both of you will have some level of expertise, but one is at the basic level and another is on a much higher level of regulatory control. So our recommendations to national regulatory authorities is that at least at any point, you should strive to reach the basic level of regulatory control and enforcement. And then according to, and when you have finances, upon availability of funds, upon availability of resources, then you can move from the basic level of regulatory control to the expanded level of control. So I've also put this nice slide here that explains also some of the elements that are recommended for the basic level of control and some that are recommended for the expanded level of control. And I'm not going to go into the details because I'm also being mindful of the time. Again, we have provided recommendations, for example, under local production, what needs to be in place. For example, there has to be a policy to address local production, because local production can contribute to better access. And so there is a need to support local manufacturers for timely market authorization. Again, the issue of regulatory testing has also been emphasized, but key message here is that we discourage routine testing pre-market. And I'm sure my colleague Anita would also maybe speak about this when she's doing her presentation tomorrow. I think I have 2 more slides to go, but briefly on chapter 5, this is quite a new chapter in the Global Model Regulatory Framework, where we are providing recommendations. We are providing recommendations in terms of approach for the different regulatory pathways. For example, we have provided recommendation on regulatory pathway during routine standard registration pathway. What is the level of information that needs to be requested between the 4 classes of medical devices? But also we have provided recommendations on regulatory pathway based on reliance. So when you are relying, what is the level of information that needs to be provided to the National Regulatory Authority or need to be requested to the applicant? Again, regulatory pathway for emergency use authorization, which was very popular during the pandemic, especially COVID-19 pandemic. So we have provided very practical recommendation on what will be the document or what will be the approach or in terms of market authorization during emergency situation. And also regulatory pathway for combination product. We understand this is also one of the problematic area for many national regulatory authorities. And so what are the information that needs to be requested, for example, if a product is a combination? So let me just go back a little bit. So how do you determine that this is a combination product? And once you determine that this is a combination product, what is the regulatory pathway that you need to follow in order to have this product in the market, and also regulatory pathway for donated medical devices, but also borderline products. We have also additional chapters under Chapter 8 and Chapter 9. As I mentioned previously, Chapter 9 was really to address some of the feedback that we had received previously in terms of developing a roadmap, how to start regulating medical devices, what kind of regulatory capacity that is required, how do we involve, for example, stakeholders in the regulatory processes. So these are all some of the recommendations that you will benefit when you go through the global model regulatory framework. And just this is, I think this is just going to be my final slide. So in summary, and really to explain this particular slide, is that the global model regulatory framework and of course the GBT plus medical devices are two critical documents. I call them interconnected tool or complementary forces that really work together to strengthen regulatory systems, improving convergence of regulatory requirements, but also reduce variability in medical devices requirements. They are also very important tool for capacity building, as I think you would also attest when we go through the second and third day. So there is a heavy benefit which is on capacity building, which would really result into a more resilient and efficient, stable regulatory systems. And I think this is almost my last slide. And I think that the rollout of GBT plus medical device will transform the regulatory landscape for medical devices, along with the implementation of the principles of the WHO Global Model Regulatory Framework. I know I've gone a little bit beyond time, but I once again thank my colleagues for allowing me to present on the GMRIF, and I'll be happy to take questions during the question and answer session. So thank you very much, and hand it over back to you, Andrea.
Thank you very much, Agnes. And Alfonso, if you allow me, I share my screen now to jump into the next presentation. So let's get that going. And also just if someone can confirm, just that you can see that in the presentation mode. Great, thank you so much. So the WHO has a regulatory system strengthening program, and that's very much related to the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly number 3 on good health, where we have target 3.8, and that is related to achieving universal health coverage and ultimately access to quality essential healthcare services and access to safe, effective, quality, and affordable essential medicines, vaccines for all. But we do see that this particular Sustainable Development Goal, along with the resolution coming from the World Health Assembly 6720 in 2024, it really identifies that a strong regulatory system is critical to a well-functioning healthcare system and the attainment of universal healthcare coverage. So when we have a look at the WHO member states, we see that there's quite an issue in terms of the maturity level of these member states. We use the global benchmarking tool to assess and determine the maturity level. And you can see that about 50% of the member states are operating at maturity level 1, and a small percentage is at maturity level 3 or 4, only 31%. So in light of this situation, the regulatory system strengthening program sets out to build capacity in member states and also promote regulatory cooperation, convergence, and transparency through networking, work sharing, and reliance. So when we have a look at the World Health Assembly resolution and these objectives and the ultimate goal of the RSS program, the Regulatory System Strengthening Program, that is to promote access to quality assured medical products, including medical devices. Within the regulatory system strengthening activities, we see that we have got some apologies. We have got some activities that related to enabling patients faster access to products, and that's through the collaborative registration procedure, promoting regulatory harmonization, convergence and networking, strengthening national control laboratories, supporting countries to develop strategies to prevent substandard and falsified products, strengthening vigilance system, and building the capacity of regulatory systems based on the GBT. So ultimately, based on the World Health Assembly Resolution 6720, we may consider what is WHO going to do about that. And essentially, the member states had tasked WHO with evaluating national regulatory systems and apply WHO evaluation tools, then consider the regulatory system performance, facilitate institutional development plans, and provide technical support wherever there may be gaps identified. So I think this is quite an important slide that we see here, which is the WHO 5-step capacity building model for national regulatory authorities. You can see that the first step was for us to develop a tool that could be used to assess regulatory systems, and that is the global benchmarking tool, the GBT. We have the WHO team through the Regulatory System Strengthening Program benchmarking national regulatory authorities upon their request. And then through the use of the tool, we are able to identify the strengths of national regulatory systems as well as those areas for improvements. Now, with the global benchmarking tool plus medical devices, we are able to do this benchmarking or assessment for regulatory systems for medical devices, including IVDs. Once we have completed the benchmarking activity, we identify those gaps and document what we call IDPs, Institutional Development Plans. Those are basically recommendations that come from WHO that identify those gaps and then make recommendations as to how countries could then go about to implement those recommendations to cover those gaps that were identified. We also have a very strong system for providing technical support and training in support of any gaps or areas of improvement that were identified and doing regular monitoring. You also see in this slide, there is the Coalition of Interested Parties Network, which is able to provide support along each of these 5 steps of the capacity building model. So currently, the CIP network has got 32 members. These are made up of partners, global partners, who are providing technical or financial support to national regulatory authorities for the purpose of regulatory system strengthening. And the network is a voluntary network, and it is really established to have a coordinated and unified approach to providing support for regulatory system strengthening. We have seen very good impact in terms of directing CIP network support directly to those IDPs that were identified during benchmarking activities. And through the support of the network, we are also seeing that there is very quick progression in terms of maturity level for regulatory functions and IDP implementation. Also important to note that this type of regulatory system strengthening that is well supported by CIP network members is an activity led by the National Regulatory Authority. So it's still up to the National Regulatory Authority to guide CIP network members in terms of how, when, what, and where the type of support would look like. We as WHO facilitate communication sharing that support is directed to IDPs. And you can see last year in 2024, we had CIP network support in all of the 6 regions that WHO has identified in over 38 countries, over 288 activities, and over $125 million of investment in regulatory system strengthening. There you can see a resource. This is the WHO Global Benchmarking Tool Manual, as well as the GBT that was established for blood and blood products and medical devices. And on this slide, you have access to the links of those resources. This is an important slide because it also shows the regulatory functions that we see identified in the GBT. So we have to consider the product life cycle from pre-market to post-market activities. And you see that for medical devices, there's a specific function, which is the post-market surveillance, market surveillance, and control function, which is very much focused on those post-market activities, import controls. And this is an overall picture. Here you can also see which functions are specifically related to blood products and the non-common functions for blood products. But ultimately, we see the functional areas like the national regulatory system, regulatory inspection, licensing, clinical trial oversight, laboratory testing, market authorization, and specific for medical devices is this PS function. In terms of the benchmarking process, we usually start out with a self-benchmarking. That is when the National Regulatory Authority downloads the computerized GBT. We provide a SharePoint for the self-benchmarking activity. So that is a safe and confidential repository for the National Regulatory Authority to upload evidence of implementation for the various indicators within the benchmarking tool. Once the self-benchmarking is completed by the National Regulatory Authority, we are able to verify the self-benchmarking data file that is submitted by the National Regulatory Authority. And based on readiness, we can then do a formal benchmarking, assess the regulatory system of the country, and identify any areas for improvement which would be documented as IDPs. Then there's also the continuous process of monitoring and further development where needed. In terms of the GBT, there are 4 maturity levels. Maturity level 1, which is considered that the system has got no formal approach, versus maturity level 4, where we see that continuous improvement is emphasized. And the maturity levels are based and developed upon ISO 9004. Ultimately, the goal is for national regulatory systems to reach maturity level 3, which is considered a stable and formal system approach and a national regulatory system that is stable, well-functioning, and integrated. So in terms of the GBT, throughout the requirements documented in the GBT, you can see the promotion of good regulatory practices. National regulatory authorities are required to implement quality management system. There are also indicators within the GBT that promote responsiveness to preventing and detecting substandard and falsified products, as well as options available to deal with emergencies. So there are also 2 resources here: good regulatory practice and good reliance practice guidelines, which are very important. WHO has also published the guideline on the implementation of a quality management system for national regulatory authorities. And we've also published the Global Competency Framework for regulators. In terms of the Global Competency Framework, this is a great document which provides some insight in terms of how to determine role-specific related competencies and to also facilitate the output of various documents such as the Organizational Competency Manual, training plans, staff competency assessments, or even job profiles. We will be piloting a digitalized tool of the Global Competency Framework so that it can be easier for national regulatory authorities to apply this framework. In terms of WLA, this is WHO listed authorities, And you may be familiar with the term stringent regulatory authority, which has been replaced by this concept of WLA. And the WLA is really an initiative that allows for a very transparent and evidence-based way for national regulatory authorities to be identified and globally recognized. And it's really based on the concept of reliance, whereby countries could rely on WHO-listed authorities. And so we're really promoting and optimizing reliance pathways to decrease burden on regulatory authorities, to prevent duplicative work. And you see the first 3 WLAs that were announced in 2023, and the list, of course, is growing. In terms of WLA, it's a little different to being assessed through the GBT. There's an extra layer of performance evaluation that goes along with a WHO listed authority process. And the GBT is very much focused on maturity level, while WLA is de-linked from the concept of maturity level, but is specific to performance evaluation of the national regulatory system. So GBT is considering how well a regulatory system is configured, whereas WLA is considering how well does this regulatory system operate. There is kind of a process to the performance evaluation through WLA, and you can see that maturity level 1, 2, and 3 of the GBT have to be 100% implemented, with 36 out of 57 maturity level 4 sub-indicators in the GBT have to be fully implemented before a country can consider going for a WLA evaluation. Here again are some resources available in terms of the WLA. The links here are available. And also just then to reflect upon how many countries have actually gone through this process. So as of 2024, this is a cumulative table, 97 member states have undertaken some benchmarking activities. I've already shared with you that the vast majority, almost half, have got a maturity level at ML1 or ML2, and our goal is to reach ML3. There are also reasons why we are saying ML3. If a country has production in local production, they would not be able to go for pre-qualification if the national regulatory authority in that country has not reached maturity level 3. And also NRAs at the ML3 or ML4 would be eligible for WLA performance evaluation process. So when you look just at a heat map in terms of a global picture, you can see those countries who have already been listed as WHO-listed authorities. Those are in purple. Those countries highlighted in green have been benchmarked, and those in blue have been self-benchmarked. It gives a really great overall picture of the current status amongst member states. And we can also see that WHO has been expanding its pool of experts for assessment of GBT or of WLA. We often invite colleagues from national regulatory authorities to support us in benchmarking activities. And here you can see in the region of the Americas, we've got 23 experts in our pool. And also in terms of training regulators based on the needs that come out of IDPs, you can see again for the region of the Americas, quite a number of training interventions taking place over the years. So again, just looking at this heat map and the distribution in green, you can see those countries that were benchmarked and are either maturity level 3 or 4. In purple, you see those countries that are listed on the transitional list as transitional arrangements were put in place as we moved towards the WLA framework. And then here in the green and black stripes, you see those countries who were on the transitional list and have been benchmarked. So much progress is done, and I think there's great excitement to see interest in the initiative, especially now expanding to medical devices, having countries on board, requesting to be benchmarked, wanting to get support for self-benchmarking in the context of medical devices. This is certainly quite encouraging. And here you can just see a picture of the regulatory system strengthening team at WHO. Thank you very much. Alfonso, over to you.
Thank you very much for both of those comprehensive presentations. I think you have given us a really clear overview as to what we're going to be developing and delving into over the next 3 days. So now we're getting to the end. Actually, we've only got about 2 minutes left of day 1 of this workshop. I would like to just share with you a couple of takeaways before we move on. The first one, I'd like to remind you that you can use the Q&A box that is down on the lower bar of the screen for any specific questions that you may have. And secondly, we'll be waiting for you tomorrow, eagerly awaiting as we continue with session 2 of this workshop. You can use the same link that you received today. I also want to share with you, let me see if I'm able to share this. Please confirm that you can see the screen here. Thank you, Alfonso. Yes, we can see it. On the screen, this is SharePoint that we prepared to share information, key information for all of the participants, where we see descriptions of all of the objectives of today's activities, expected results, as well as key coverage of specific tools that we addressed overall that I think will be highly beneficial. And here we have access to a specific file so that you can install the computer documents. And then here in this, we have the list of presentations that we will be looking at every day. Remember, day 3, Wednesday, we don't have a virtual session. The presentations are only available in English right now, but we will annex those. We'll add the ones translated into Spanish and Portuguese subsequently. Just to conclude, I just want to conclude with a message that we've already heard. The GBT Plus is not just an evaluation tool. It's a tool for strengthening regulatory frameworks. So we'll be able to identify those areas for improvements with a key objective.
The goal is to have medical devices available for the population to be available in a safe, efficient way and of quality. Also, with this tool, we offer a concrete roadmap in order to promote health improvements. And with this, we build regulatory confidence and we look for the promotion of cooperation among countries. So, what is the overall purpose? Well, to protect the public health and to ensure equitable access to health technologies. To everybody, thank you for your participation today, and we expect to see you tomorrow. May you have a good rest of the day. See you soon.